I kind of wanted to talk about your early life in Toledo because Toledo is definitely a city that's constantly evolving. And so, what was life like for you when you were here in Toledo?
I began to live in Toledo when I was in the sixth grade. My mother and I moved there. We were living on the west side. Then we moved to the east side, Woodville Road, and an old house that had once long ago been the farmhouse of her family, but by then was surrounded by smaller, newer houses and was actually condemned, I think, by the city, but we moved in anyway. Um, and it really, in that way that your teenage years form you, it really had a great influence on me. Um, Waite High School, where I went. Well, I went to Raymer uh, grade school and then Waite High School. Was, for instance, devoted to football. And it was not only a sport, but it was often the singular way that young men who were students could get a scholarship and get into college or university. Um, it forms us, absolutely. And I was always conscious both of my generation and my parents' generations in the city.
And what's interesting too, in talking about the high school years, one thing is you definitely notice different things. And so, what was life like in terms of feminism back then when people really weren't having these conversations?
I do not remember hearing the word feminism. I was in love with Louisa May Alcott from when I was much younger. And in retrospect, she clearly was a feminist. There was a much older woman math teacher, I remember, who, by her life example, she was a single woman and clearly living a happy life. So it wasn't united in a movement, at least not in ways that I was aware of, but there always were important examples to follow.
And what tends to continue even after the years of progress in the feminist movement, because it definitely is one of those movements that evolved because we now at least have a word to describe the movement. But one of the things that's still consistent to this day is there's disrespect to women in our society. And so, what advice do you give to the younger generations that are really going to have to tap out this fire and kind of stomp it out?
Well, my first advice is do what you think is right, and I'll help you because I can't know the circumstances that they are responding to and living with. So what they think should happen is most important. Um, but also, as you say, the concept of fairness. I mean, little kids from a very young age say it's not fair. And that single sentence is the beginning of every revolution. Of course, we're in a different stage of it now. I mean, this country, um, for instance, is undergoing, I think, some limited but still unfortunate resistance because the people who say you will not replace us seem to be referring to the fact that we are becoming, in fact, we have already become a majority people of color country. That is, the first generation that is majority babies of color has already been born. And I fear that that's what some of the Trumpers are referring to. So it may be a moment of resistance, but it doesn't mean that we are not going to continue to move forward.
One of the many ways that you have really pushed the limits here and really inspired change was through messaging. And of course, Miss Magazine was a big part of that and still is a big part of that. And so, talk about just the impact of media and actually telling stories of people that aren't often heard and often don't have their stories told.
Well, because just by aspiration, I always wanted to be a writer and a journalist. I first, when I moved to New York, helped to start New York Magazine, which was the first of the city magazines. And then we incorporated within it a sample issue of Ms. Magazine, and discovered to my amazement that that issue sold off the newsstands. We were meant to be there for 6 weeks and it disappeared in less than a week, I believe. So we could see that there was definitely an audience for it. Once we started it, we could also see that advertisers in women's magazines expected to receive what they called complimentary copy. That is, if it was a food company, they expected there to be recipes. If there was a car company, they expected you to show the car with the woman. It was way too connected to editorial content. Therefore, we decided to become a foundation so we could generate contributions and not be dependent on advertising.
There still are definitely those parallels we notice in society where women are being objectified. And so, how do you really change that, especially when there are a lot of men that are in power?
Uh, well, it's always an interesting organizing challenge to figure out what to do about each instance of unfairness. What are examples? I mean, I remember once sitting in the halls of Congress where there was a committee of men who were having a hearing on something that had to do with basic fairness. I've forgotten what it was exactly. Um, and one of the men who was most hostile had a daughter in the audience who would periodically get up from her seat, go up and whisper in his ear, "I am ashamed of you," and then come back to, I mean, I thought that was a great instance of individual rebellion. But we write letters, we do interviews online, we try to suggest practical, more fair ways of behaving and appeal to the individual or the group and the enlightened self-interest of that individual and group.
And that's a great example of someone who is of a younger age tapping into that confidence to stand up for something that they believe in. And so, how do younger people find that in them? Because I know some people it comes more naturally, and then for others, it takes a lot more time.
I think it often starts at home because the family is a social unit, and the question of how necessary labor is distributed in that unit is crucial. Is the man of the household, or if it's two women, or both women of the household, doing equally the maintenance work that needs to be done? Does the daughter have the same kind of parietal rules as the son, or does the son have more freedom than the daughter? Just because of that, the family or the whatever the group is that we're growing up in is our model of a nation, you might say. So the more we experience fairness there, the more likely we are to establish fairness afterward.
And how do you look at this? Because obviously, culturally, there are a lot of differences globally.
Well, we obviously need to work with and ask the women and all the activists in the country itself. After I graduated from college, I went to live in India for 2 years. The independence movement was still visible at that time, so there was an idea of fairness. But there were many evidences of unfairness, of caste, of what women could do and what men could do. But there was an atmosphere of change and the possibility of change that was very valuable. Also, I discovered, I assumed that the Gandhian movement was led by Gandhi, right? So I was trying to write something about it. So I was going around to interview people who had worked with him and known him before he died. And I went to interview a woman named Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, great woman, who was sitting on her veranda rocking. And she listened to me patiently. And finally she said, "Well, my dear, we taught him everything he knew." And she explained to me that the massive women's movement dealing with sati and caste and, arranging marches to the sea to get salt illegally, everything that they were doing was really the basis of the Gandhian movement.
And what's interesting about a lot of these movements is the fact that they really spread because no movement stays contained. Every movement spreads. And so looking back on your career as an activist, what does it look like, after just with hindsight? Because seeing all the changes that have been made just as a result of all these movements, for me, that would be pretty overwhelming.
Yes, no, it's very satisfying, regardless of how small or large the change you see is, whether it's children having the last names of both parents until they get to be adults and can, if they want to, choose whichever or yet a third name. That was not happening when I was growing up. It's the assumption that women as well as men can have a career outside the home, and men as well as women are responsible for what goes inside the home. Those are all way more evident have become way more evident in my lifetime than they were. And it's very satisfying to see.
And my final question for you is looking at this next generation of young people that are now going to be in power very soon, if not already, what would you say that they most importantly have to think about when they consider being an activist and really carrying the torch?
Hmm. It's not for me to say. I trust their instincts. Um, if one word comes to mind, it's empathy. Think if we can look at others and at least try to imagine how we might feel in their situation, I think this greatly keeps us from objectifying or from otherizing groups of people. And perhaps also it might be helpful to understand that how this country is changing, so we understand the resistance of a few, that we are on the verge of becoming a majority non-white country. I mean, as I was saying, I think the first generation of babies who are not majority white babies has already been born. If we understand that and look at it as the gift it truly is, in terms of looking like the world and understanding the world and learning from diversity, I think viewing change as a positive makes it more positive and also unifies us going forward.